The collapse of the Eastern Front in the summer of 1944 marked a decisive shift in the trajectory of World War II. Following the catastrophic losses incurred during Operation Bagration, the German Wehrmacht was in retreat across vast stretches of territory once held firmly under the swastika. Soviet forces surged forward, reclaiming Belarus and pressing into the Baltic states with renewed intensity. Among the shifting front lines, a significant contingent of German forces found themselves increasingly isolated in the Latvian region of Courland, a rugged peninsula bordered by the Baltic Sea. This enclave would soon become known as the Courland Pocket, Nazi Germany's last eastern redoubt, where over 200,000 Axis troops would be encircled and held in place until the very end of the war. The origins of the Courland entrapment lie in a strategic tug-of-war between Hitler's ideological fixation on territorial control and the stark military realities unfolding on the Eastern Front. As Soviet forces executed deep penetration operations into the heart of Army Group North's operational zones, Hitler refused to authorize a full withdrawal from the Baltic region. For him, the loss of Courland symbolized not only a military setback, but also a political and ideological defeat, one he was unwilling to countenance. The peninsula held strategic significance as a base for the Kriegsmarine, with its ports offering access to the Baltic Sea. Yet, as Soviet forces cut off land access from East Prussia and Lithuania, the remaining German forces became increasingly reliant on tenuous naval supply lines through the Gulf of Riga. The geopolitical context of the Courland Pocket was rooted in Germany's declining capacity to manage simultaneous fronts. While the Western Allies pressed from Normandy and the Mediterranean, the Soviet Union's Red Army was absorbing tremendous losses while inflicting even greater ones. The Baltics, under German occupation since 1941, had been transformed into militarized zones with entrenched defense lines, forced labor operations, and scorched earth policies. Latvia, and particularly Courland, had become a bastion for ethnic German resettlement and military fortification. With Soviet forces sweeping westward, these territories became increasingly indefensible. At the time of the Courland entrapment, the German command had restructured Army Group North, which was responsible for holding the line in the Baltics. In October 1944, as Soviet advances severed the land corridor, the trapped forces were renamed Army Group Courland. Comprising primarily the remnants of German 16th and 18th Armies, along with various auxiliary units and Latvian collaborators, the formation remained under the nominal command of Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, a notorious disciplinarian and ardent Nazi loyalist. Despite mounting evidence that the position was untenable, Schörner repeatedly echoed Hitler's determination to hold the Courland line. The encirclement was not sudden, but the result of a series of coordinated Soviet offensives that exploited German overextension. As the Red Army executed the Baltic Offensive between September and November 1944, they cut off German access to East Prussia and forced a complete reorientation of German defenses. While Soviet armies advanced through Lithuania and into central Latvia, German forces were pushed into an increasingly compressed defensive position in the Courland Peninsula. From this moment onward, Courland ceased to be a launchpad for German operations and instead became a siege zone, one in which vast military resources were committed not for strategic gain, but to delay the inevitable collapse of Nazi resistance. Meanwhile, the local population found themselves caught between collapsing regimes. Soviet partisans had been active in the Latvian forests for years, engaging in sabotage and resistance operations. German retribution had been severe, with entire villages razed and populations displaced. As front lines shifted and battles drew closer, civilians either fled westward with retreating German forces or were caught up in the brutal reprisals and forced deportations that characterized the Soviet reconquest. For the Latvians, the battle for Courland was not a question of national liberation, but a prelude to renewed repression under Soviet rule. Strategically, the retention of Courland baffled many within the German High Command. With the Eastern Front collapsing elsewhere, the thousands of troops and substantial material locked in the pocket could have potentially reinforced defenses in East Prussia or contributed to the defense of Berlin. However, Hitler's intransigence remained the final word. He declared Courland a fortress to be held at all costs. The entrapment was not the result of a single mistake, but of a series of compounding failures and illusions that extended the suffering of soldiers and civilians alike, long after the war was already lost in principle. As the encirclement tightened, the Courland Peninsula braced for the battles to come. In October 1944, the full encirclement of the Courland Peninsula solidified as Soviet forces completed the Baltic offensive. With the capture of Riga on October 13th, the land connection between Army Group North and the remainder of the German Eastern Front was irrevocably severed. The units left behind, over 200,000 troops, were reorganized into Army Group Courland. Their new reality was grim, isolated from main German forces, reliant entirely on the Kriegsmarine for supply, and facing an emboldened Red Army determined to expunge the last Nazi presence from the Baltics. Yet, despite this strategic disadvantage, Hitler maintained the illusion that Courland remained a viable front, ordering it to be defended as a bridgehead for future offensives that would never materialize. The German forces in Courland rapidly dug in, utilizing the region's natural defenses, dense forests, rivers, and marshes, combined with extensive trench networks, bunkers, and minefields. The terrain favored the defenders, and years of occupation had enabled the construction of formidable fortifications. Units were reorganized under the command of General Oberst Lothar Rendulic, who replaced Schörner briefly, and later General Oberst Karl Hilpert. Their orders remained consistent: hold position, prevent Soviet naval access to the Baltic, and deny the Red Army any symbolic victory in the region. On the Soviet side, the formation tasked with clearing Courland was the 2nd and 3rd Baltic Fronts, under the overall command of Marshal Leonid Govorov and General Andrei Yeryomenko. Soviet intelligence estimated the strength and fortification level of the German forces in Courland and devised a strategy based on successive offensives designed to break through the defensive belts. These operations, however, were not granted unlimited resources. Stalin and the Stavka were already preparing for the decisive thrust into East Prussia and Berlin. Thus, Courland remained a secondary front, an irritating but strategically limited outpost of Nazi resistance. The First Courland battle began on October 15, 1944. Soviet artillery initiated the assault with a thunderous barrage along the front, followed by coordinated infantry and armor advances aimed at penetrating German lines south of Liepaja and along the Venta River. The Red Army faced stiff resistance. German divisions, including elements of the elite 11th Infantry Division and 205th Infantry Division, held their lines with bitter determination. The terrain slowed Soviet armor, while German artillery inflicted heavy casualties. By the end of October, Soviet forces had gained minor territorial advances, but failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The front stabilized once again, setting the tone for the months to follow. Waves of Soviet offensives met by entrenched German defenders unwilling to retreat. Life within the Courland pocket took on an increasingly claustrophobic tone. Supplies arrived sporadically via Kriegsmarine transport ships, vulnerable to Soviet submarines and aircraft. Food shortages, medical supplies scarcities, and deteriorating equipment hampered German effectiveness. Yet morale, though tested, remained relatively high. Soldiers were bombarded with propaganda portraying Courland as a heroic last stand. Command emphasized duty, valor, and the defense of the Reich, presenting the isolation as a mark of honor rather than abandonment. In truth, Many within the German ranks began to suspect they had been sacrificed for political theater. Soviet command launched the Second Courland battle on November 1st, hoping to capitalize on the minimal gains of the previous assault. Once again, Soviet forces targeted the Saldus area and attempted to breach the southern sector of the pocket. The result was another grinding stalemate. While the Soviets managed to push back the German front lines by a few kilometers, they suffered disproportionately high casualties. The cost of storming entrenched positions in poor weather against prepared defenses made each advance brutally costly. By mid-November, the offensive was halted once more. Strategically, both sides faced a dilemma. For the Soviets, committing more forces to Courland threatened to divert strength from the main offensives into Poland and Germany. For the Germans, the troops in Courland could not be easily evacuated or reinforced, and their continued resistance drained valuable resources. Yet, the impasse endured. Hitler issued repeated orders forbidding any withdrawal from Courland, framing it as a fortress in the east. Even when German military leaders proposed a strategic evacuation to consolidate forces elsewhere, the suggestions were dismissed. The naval dimension of Courland played a quiet but crucial role. German naval convoys, under constant threat from Soviet torpedo boats and submarines, maintained tenuous contact with the pocket. The Kriegsmarine deployed minesweepers, destroyers, and auxiliary vessels to escort transport ships, delivering fuel, munitions, and food. However, these efforts were inconsistent and dangerous, especially during winter storms and under the watchful eyes of the Soviet Baltic Fleet. The sea lifeline kept Courland from complete collapse, but it could not change the fundamental isolation of the pocket. Meanwhile, local Latvian involvement added a complex layer to the Courland equation. The Latvian Legion, a Waffen-SS formation composed of conscripts and volunteers, played a prominent role in defending the pocket. For many Latvians, this alliance with Germany was driven by the fear of renewed Soviet occupation and reprisals. Having already experienced mass deportations and executions during the first Soviet occupation of 1940–41, Latvian fighters viewed German command as a lesser evil. Their participation in the defense of Courland would later become a contentious topic in the Baltic states' post-war memory. By the end of 1944, the Courland pocket had solidified into a frozen front. Over 25 German divisions remained trapped but operational. The Soviet command had launched two major offensives with only limited success. The lines stabilized, with neither side able or willing to risk the losses needed for a decisive engagement. As the world turned its eyes toward the Ardennes offensive in the west and the looming battles for Warsaw and Berlin, Courland faded into the margins of war reporting. Yet for those within its cold forests and bunkered positions, the winter of 1944–45 was only the beginning of a long and fruitless siege. As 1945 dawned, the Courland pocket remained a glaring anomaly on the Eastern Front. While the Red Army was preparing its final push toward Berlin, this isolated wedge of Nazi control persisted in the Baltic, sustained more by ideological rigidity than strategic necessity. The German High Command continued to assert the value of holding Courland as a means of pinning down Soviet forces, preventing their redeployment to more decisive theaters. Yet even this rationale was increasingly tenuous, as Soviet command deprioritized the region in favor of their main thrusts through Poland, Silesia, and toward the Oder River. Nevertheless, combat resumed in Courland with renewed vigor in January 1945, marking the beginning of the Third Courland Battle. The Third Battle, initiated on January 23, 1945, unfolded in the depth of winter, under brutal conditions. Soviet forces, now under the Leningrad Front following the reorganization of commands, launched a concentrated offensive against the German positions near Saldus and along the Venta River. This sector, having already borne the brunt of previous offensives, was heavily fortified with multiple trench lines, bunkers, and pre-sighted artillery positions. The Red Army committed the 4th Shock Army and 51st Army, supported by heavy artillery and armor, hoping to overwhelm the defenders through attrition and pressure. Yet once again, German resistance proved formidable. Soviet forces adopted a strategy of encirclement and suppression, limiting offensive operations to reconnaissance in force and artillery bombardments. Meanwhile, German commanders in Courland took this respite to reinforce their positions, rotate frontline units, and dig deeper into the snow-laden terrain. Throughout February and March, the pocket entered a state of grim equilibrium. For the soldiers stationed there, the monotony of waiting, the cold, and the uncertainty created a psychological burden as severe as any combat engagement. German officers attempted to maintain discipline and morale through propaganda, ceremonies, and promises of eventual relief. Yet the men on the ground, aware of the collapse unfolding in Germany, began to question the purpose of their continued resistance. Rumors of Soviet advances to the Oder, the fall of Budapest, and the encirclement of Berlin filtered in through clandestine radio and prisoner interrogation. The belief that Courland was no longer part of a coherent war strategy grew steadily. The Fourth Courland battle erupted on February 20th, a last major attempt by the Soviets to break the German line before spring. Concentrating once more on the Saldus sector, the Red Army employed a broader front and deeper reserves, including artillery concentrations unprecedented in the Courland campaign. Despite the ferocity of the assault, German defenders held firm. Counterattacks restored lost positions, and well-placed artillery decimated advancing Soviet columns. Aerial support from the Luftwaffe, though greatly diminished, provided occasional relief, strafing Soviet concentrations and supply lines. As spring approached, the pocket's strategic relevance diminished further. Hitler's directives continued to insist on the retention of Courland. Yet his influence was waning in the face of reality. The German war machine was collapsing across all fronts. Silesia was breached, Vienna was under threat, and Berlin was preparing for siege. Army Group Courland, still numbering over 180,000 troops, remained operational but effectively frozen in place. The troops trapped there were among the most isolated in the Wehrmacht, cut off not just from resupply, but from the wider context of a war that had already shifted past them. Inside the pocket, the situation for civilians had become dire. Latvian towns and villages bore the scars of repeated artillery barrages and scorched earth tactics. Food shortages, displacement, and the presence of both retreating German forces and advancing Soviet patrols created a climate of fear and instability. Partisan activity increased in the forests, with both Soviet and local anti-German groups conducting raids, assassinations, and sabotage. German authorities responded with brutal reprisals, deepening the cycle of violence and alienation. The civilian population, Latvian, German, and other ethnic groups, was left to navigate a treacherous liminal space between two collapsing powers. The Fifth Courland battle began in late March, but it was no longer a determined Soviet attempt at conquest. Instead, it represented a final series of pushes to degrade German capacity and to test the strength of their remaining formations. These skirmishes, often localized and short-lived, reflected the reality that Soviet priorities had shifted permanently. The Red Army's logistical and command apparatus was focused westward toward the Vistula, the Oder, and ultimately Berlin. The Soviet High Command calculated that the forces in Courland could be left to rot, starved of supply, cut off by sea, and broken not by assault, but by inevitability. In the final weeks of April, with Soviet troops entering the outskirts of Berlin and Allied forces advancing through western Germany, Army Group Courland remained in defensive positions, awaiting orders that would never come. The defenders, veterans of campaigns from Leningrad to the Dnieper, were now guardians of a ghost front. Their entrenchments, their machine gun nests, and their artillery placements stood not as bulwarks of strategy, but as relics of a collapsing ideology. The end was coming, and the question was no longer one of victory, but of survival. On May 8, 1945, as the guns fell silent across Europe and Germany capitulated unconditionally to the Allied powers, the Courland pocket remained one of the few places where tens of thousands of German troops still held their positions, rifles loaded, awaiting instructions that had become irrelevant. Army Group Courland, now a relic of Hitler's rigid wartime doctrine, found itself cut off from the chain of command, surrounded, and utterly alone. The formal surrender order reached the pocket through naval and radio communications only hours before it was to take effect. For the men entrenched in the forests and bunkers of Courland, the announcement confirmed what had long been suspected. Berlin had fallen, the Reich was gone, and their resistance had no further meaning. General Oberst Karl Hilpert, commander of Army Group Courland, formally surrendered to Marshal Leonid Govorov of the Leningrad Front on May 9, 1945. The surrender included over 180,000 German troops, including regular Wehrmacht units, Waffen-SS detachments, Latvian auxiliaries, and remaining Kriegsmarine personnel stationed in the port cities of Ventspils and Liepaja. The capitulation was executed without significant resistance, though isolated fighting and confusion persisted in outlying sectors during the final hours. Soviet forces moved in swiftly to disarm, process, and transport the surrendered troops to prisoner-of-war camps. For the Soviets, the capture of Courland was more a matter of administrative closure than battlefield triumph. The pocket had tied up divisions and resources for months, but by the end of the war, it had become a frozen conflict zone with limited strategic value. Yet symbolically, the fall of Courland represented the final expulsion of Nazi forces from Soviet soil, a long-awaited vindication after years of brutal occupation, mass killings, and economic devastation. In Moscow, state media celebrated the surrender as the last blow against fascism in the Baltic. The fate of the surrendered troops was grim. The Soviet Union, reeling from immense wartime losses and driven by a desire for retribution, did not treat German prisoners with clemency. Thousands were marched under armed escort to transit camps and railway depots. Many would be transported deep into the Soviet interior, Kazakhstan, Siberia, and the Urals to work in forced labor camps as part of Stalin's vast Gulag system. Disease, malnutrition, and exposure claimed countless lives in the years that followed. Survivors would trickle back to Germany only in the late 1940s and early 1950s, with some not released until 1955. Latvian units that had served alongside the Germans met an especially tragic fate. Although many had joined under the belief that they were defending their homeland from Soviet tyranny, the returning Red Army labeled them traitors and collaborators. Those captured were typically not treated as prisoners of war, but as criminals. Large numbers were executed, imprisoned, or deported. Civilians suspected of aiding or sympathizing with the German forces faced similar persecution. Entire communities were uprooted, properties seized, and cultural institutions dismantled as the Soviet regime reasserted control over the Baltic states with brutal efficiency. The region of Courland itself bore the deep scars of prolonged militarization and conflict. Towns like Saldus, Kuldega, and Talsi had been transformed into fortified zones, their infrastructure shattered by artillery and occupation. Agricultural production had collapsed, and vast swathes of land were littered with mines, wreckage, and graves. In the post-war years, the Soviet government undertook extensive reconstruction efforts, often through forced labor, while simultaneously purging the region of anti-Soviet sentiment. This included mass deportations in 1949 targeting families suspected of nationalist sympathies or prior German collaboration. Courland's history was rapidly overwritten in Soviet historiography. Official narratives emphasized the liberation of the region from fascist occupiers, while silencing or distorting the more complex reality of local resistance, collaboration, and tragedy. Veterans of the Latvian Legion were excluded from post-war society, their memories suppressed, and their graves left unmarked. The German perspective on the Courland campaign likewise faded into obscurity. With the Third Reich obliterated and post-war Germany split into occupation zones, the soldiers who had fought in Courland were now viewed as remnants of a defeated and discredited ideology. Strategically, the final battles in Courland had little impact on the broader outcome of the war. By the time of their conclusion, the fate of Nazi Germany had already been sealed in the ruins of Berlin and the advance of Allied forces from both east and west. Yet the persistence of the pocket, held long after it had ceased to matter, stood as a symbol of the inflexible, delusional nature of Hitler's military leadership. Resources that might have been redeployed to defend Germany proper had been wasted holding a peninsula for ideological pride. The soldiers trapped there became unwitting participants in a doomed and unnecessary campaign. In the years following the war, Courland became a site of contested memory. For Soviet veterans, it was a final victory over fascism. For surviving German soldiers, it was a senseless waste of life. For Latvians, it was a painful chapter that blurred the lines between resistance and occupation, between heroism and survival. The battle for Courland did not end with gunfire, but with silence, an abandonment of purpose in the face of collapse. The trenches filled with rain, the bunkers collapsed into earth, and the names of the dead faded into unmarked graves across the forests of western Latvia. With the formal surrender of Army Group Courland, the last organized German resistance on the Eastern Front ceased. It marked the final extinguishing of Nazi presence in the Baltics, and with it, the closing of a harrowing chapter in one of Europe's most violently contested regions. Yet, even in surrender, the ghosts of Courland lingered. In the memories of its survivors, in the scars across its landscape, and in the unanswered question of why it had all been allowed to continue so long. The prolonged defense of the Courland pocket was marked not only by military stubbornness, but also by a logistical and strategic paradox that defined its absurdity. By early 1945, Germany was critically short of manpower, fuel, ammunition, and transportation assets. Yet nearly 250,000 troops, many of them seasoned and experienced, remained pinned in a remote Baltic peninsula, unable to affect the outcome of the war, yet ordered to hold their lines as if victory was still within reach. This irrational allocation of resources underscored a central contradiction of the Nazi war effort in its final stages: the total detachment of high command from military reality. The German supply operation to Courland, entirely maritime since October 1944, was both essential and perilous. The Kriegsmarine had to keep the pocket resupplied with munitions, food, medical equipment, and replacement personnel, while simultaneously evacuating wounded and non-essential civilians. These convoys, operating from ports like Gotenhafen and Danzig, were increasingly targeted by Soviet submarines, torpedo boats, and aircraft operating from newly recaptured bases along the Baltic coast. Losses mounted with each passing month. Ships were sunk by mines and torpedoes, and naval escorts were thinned out to reinforce more critical fronts. Despite these dangers, the Germans continued to prioritize Courland's logistics, even as the homeland starved for supplies. Hospital ships, including the Wilhelm Gustloff and the General von Steuben, which evacuated civilians and wounded from East Prussia and the Baltics, became infamous for their tragic sinkings by Soviet submarines. Though these disasters were not directly tied to Courland's supply line, they illustrated the broader vulnerability and desperation of German maritime efforts in the Baltic theater. Maintaining this tenuous lifeline, consumed ships, crews, and escorts that could have been redirected to more pressing operations in the collapsing Reich. Meanwhile, inside Courland, the morale of the garrison was eroding. Propaganda could only go so far in sustaining belief in a war that was visibly lost. Letters from home, if they arrived at all, spoke of devastation, hunger, and Allied bombs falling on cities that had once seemed invulnerable. Soldiers increasingly viewed their mission as futile. Desertion became more common, especially among non-German auxiliaries, though the penalty remained execution. Latvians, Poles, and other conscripts who had been folded into Wehrmacht or Waffen-SS units began to vanish into the forests or attempted to surrender to Soviet patrols in hopes of leniency. The command structure, too, was under strain. Karl Hilpert, though competent and pragmatic, could not change the reality that he was commanding a ghost army. He submitted multiple requests for a full or partial evacuation of Courland, arguing that these troops could help reinforce the crumbling defenses in Pomerania or Berlin. His appeals were ignored or directly rebuffed by Hitler, who continued to issue contradictory orders from the Reich Chancellery bunker. For Hitler, Courland's symbolic value outweighed its operational uselessness. It was to be a Festung, a fortress that embodied Nazi defiance and ideological permanence, even if it collapsed in isolation. Within the Soviet High Command, the decision not to press further into Courland during the final months of the war was based on cold calculation. Stalin, focused on reaching Berlin before the Western Allies and securing Central Europe for Soviet influence, saw little value in expending men and material to crush a pocket that posed no offensive threat. Instead, the Soviet First and Second Baltic fronts rotated troops out of Courland, sending divisions to reinforce operations in Silesia and Brandenburg. The remaining forces around the pocket were ordered to maintain a siege posture. No major breakthroughs, but no rest for the Germans either. Sporadic clashes continued throughout March and April, including minor Soviet probing attacks and German counterattacks aimed at disrupting enemy artillery placements or capturing prisoners for intelligence. These operations yielded few results. Casualties on both sides were relatively light compared to the great battles being fought further south. The fighting had become ritualistic, a grim dance of attrition, with each side executing its role, despite knowing that the larger war had moved beyond them. The Germans still issued orders of the day, conducted court-martials, and distributed Iron Crosses. The Soviets still held planning meetings and conducted limited assaults. But the war's center of gravity had shifted permanently. Civilian conditions within Courland, especially in urban centers like Liepaja and Ventspils, continued to deteriorate. Air raids, food shortages, disease, and displacement plagued the local population. Latvian civilians were trapped in an impossible position, distrusted by the Germans, feared by the Soviets, and forgotten by the international community. Many were forcibly evacuated with retreating German units or attempted to flee across the sea to Sweden. Others stayed and hoped for survival under whichever flag would come next. Latvian collaboration units, such as the 15th and 19th Waffen Grenadier Divisions of the SS, continued to operate under German command. These units, often composed of unwilling conscripts, fought primarily to stave off Soviet reoccupation. Their presence, however, would become a subject of fierce post-war debate, viewed by some as a tragic expression of national desperation, and by others as evidence of complicity with the Nazi regime. In the final months of the pocket's existence, their combat role diminished as supplies ran low and command structures frayed. Still, they remained among the last to surrender when the end came. The geography of Courland, forested, hilly, and difficult to traverse, further ensured that no decisive battle would unfold there. The defensive works built up over the preceding months transformed the region into a static, fortified zone. Thousands of kilometers of trenches, bunkers, and minefields crisscrossed the landscape. Yet these fortifications, though formidable, served no ultimate purpose. They defended a position that had lost all strategic weight, and each meter of barbed wire or sandbag was a testimony to the resources wasted in the service of delay. By April 1945, Soviet reconnaissance aircraft regularly flew over German positions without being challenged. Luftwaffe activity had ceased, and German fuel stores were nearly exhausted. Radios crackled with vague orders, rumors of peace talks, and news of American advances. But from their forests and dugouts, the men of Army Group Courland could only watch and wait. The wider war was ending, and yet they remained frozen, guardians of an idea that no longer existed, awaiting either surrender or annihilation. As the month of April progressed, and the Third Reich's demise became undeniable, the situation inside the Courland pocket took on an increasingly surreal quality. Cut off from any realistic chance of relief or reinforcement, the German garrison operated in a vacuum of strategy and purpose. Berlin was under siege. East Prussia had fallen. Major cities across the Reich lay in ruins, yet tens of thousands of troops in Courland still manned machine gun nests, maintained artillery positions, and patrolled forested front lines in obedience to orders that no longer bore connection to military logic. They were, in every sense, a phantom army defending the remains of an empire that had already collapsed. The Wehrmacht units inside Courland had undergone months of attrition. Although the total manpower of Army Group Courland still numbered over 180,000, many divisions were under strength, their ranks thinned by combat, illness, and lack of replacement troops. The units were a patchwork of regular infantry divisions, Volksgrenadier formations, Luftwaffe field units, Waffen-SS contingents, and Latvian auxiliaries. Some of these formations had existed as cohesive forces since the opening phases of the war in 1941. Others were recent, desperate amalgamations of survivors from crushed units elsewhere. Yet they all shared one fate: encirclement and eventual surrender. Discipline remained outwardly intact, but signs of internal collapse were visible. Ammunition rationing became stricter. Artillery shells were hoarded for only the most necessary defensive operations. Infantry conducted fewer patrols, and the once daily rhythm of drills and inspections gave way to long periods of waiting. Morale depended heavily on the unit, the leadership, and the information available. Some commanders attempted to maintain order through rigid control, others through appeals to camaraderie and duty. But among the enlisted ranks, despair was spreading. Quiet desertions increased. Soldiers began abandoning positions at night to seek food, shelter, or the chance to surrender discreetly. The Latvian formations remained active but demoralized. Most had no illusions about the return of the Soviets. Memories of mass deportations, NKVD executions, and the annihilation of Latvia's intelligentsia during the first Soviet occupation still haunted the civilian and military population. Many soldiers feared Soviet captivity more than death in combat. Some attempted to hide or make their way into civilian disguise. Others vowed to fight to the end, not out of loyalty to Germany, but out of fear of the alternative. On the Soviet side, the Courland pocket was now entirely surrounded and contained. Marshal Leonid Govorov, commanding the Leningrad front, maintained pressure through limited operations but avoided any large-scale assaults. His orders were clear: prevent breakout attempts, maintain a siege posture, and prepare to accept surrender when Berlin fell. Soviet artillery intermittently shelled German positions, and air reconnaissance tracked troop movements. However, the primary concern was no longer military. Courland had become a political and logistical problem, not a battlefield. Efforts to communicate surrender terms were subtle. Soviet loudspeakers occasionally broadcast news of Germany's imminent defeat and offered assurances of humane treatment to those who surrendered. Leaflets dropped over German lines encouraged officers to defy Hitler's orders and spare their men further suffering. For the most part, these efforts were ignored. German commanders feared reprisals for unauthorized surrender, and Hitler's decree on holding ground to the last remained technically in force. Yet the psychological impact of these messages grew with each day. The certainty of defeat was now unquestionable. Meanwhile, the internal administration of the Courland pocket continued in a strange mimicry of order. Military tribunals were still convened. Awards were still issued. Messages were still sent to higher command structures that no longer functioned. In some areas, German soldiers helped rebuild civilian infrastructure, digging trenches one day and repairing roads or rail lines the next. Local Latvian civilians were coerced into providing food, firewood, and labor. Black markets thrived, and alcohol, especially stolen Soviet vodka, became a sought-after commodity in the final weeks. The port cities of Liepāja and Ventspils served as the last logistical arteries of the Courland enclave. Though increasingly inactive due to fuel shortages and the growing presence of Soviet naval assets, these ports still saw sporadic activity. A handful of Kriegsmarine vessels made supply runs or attempted to evacuate key personnel, but these were risky undertakings. The once proud Baltic fleet of Nazi Germany was now a skeleton force, unable to contest Soviet dominance at sea. As April wore on, naval operations became symbolic more than strategic. By the last days of the month, communication with Germany had become intermittent and fragmented. Orders arrived late, if at all. Messages from surviving high command elements contradicted one another. Some urged continued resistance, others hinted at capitulation. Rumors spread rapidly among the troops. Berlin was encircled. Goebbels had assumed control. The Western Allies were closing in from the Elbe. Hitler was dead. None of it could be confirmed, but all of it felt true. In this climate of uncertainty, the German soldiers in Courland prepared for the inevitable, even as official orders demanded their continued vigilance. On May 1st, a final message was transmitted by the surviving OKW elements to all isolated German formations. Hold your positions, await further instructions. It would be the last directive received by Army Group Courland. 5 days later, the Third Reich would cease to exist. For the men still dug into the forests and fields of Latvia, the order to surrender came not with the sound of rifles, but through the silence of a world that had moved on without them. They were the final garrison of an empire that no longer had borders, leadership, or purpose. Their war was over, but not yet ended. On the morning of May 8, 1945, as Nazi Germany formally signed its unconditional surrender, the men of Army Group Courland remained entrenched behind barbed wire, waiting for orders that no longer held weight. The Red Army stood poised around the perimeter, artillery silent, infantry positioned but unmoving. It was a strange calm after months of attrition. No assault, no fanfare, only an air of finality. Inside the pocket, the chain of command still functioned in appearance, but the realization had set in across all levels. The war had ended elsewhere, and Courland was simply the last page in a closed book. General Oberst Karl Hilpert, commander of Army Group Courland, had by then received unambiguous confirmation that the Reich had surrendered. The order came not from Berlin, already in Soviet hands, but from Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz's provisional government in Flensburg. There was no ambiguity, no caveats, and no promise of negotiation. All German forces, wherever they stood, were to cease hostilities immediately and surrender to Allied forces. Hilpert, a seasoned and pragmatic officer, understood the implications. Continuing to fight would only result in unnecessary loss of life. For a pocket-long cutoff from the broader war effort, resistance had become not only pointless, but morally indefensible. At 14 hours on May 8, Hilpert radioed Marshal Leonid Govorov, commander of the Leningrad Front, to request terms for surrender. The message was brief, formal, and devoid of protest. It acknowledged Germany's capitulation and asked for arrangements to be made to prevent disorder during the process of disarmament. Soviet forces, well prepared for this moment, responded efficiently. They had already prepared reception areas, detention zones, and routes for moving prisoners. There would be no negotiations. The surrender was unconditional, and all German forces in Courland were to disarm immediately and prepare for transfer into Soviet custody. On May 9th, the process began. German officers handed over sidearms, regimental colors, and maps of their fortified zones. Units were instructed to destroy or disable heavy weapons, render artillery unusable, and stand down from combat readiness. The Soviet forces entered the pocket with strict discipline, enforcing order and separation of surrendered units from civilian populations. Troops were processed in groups, disarmed, and placed under guard. Despite the scale of the surrender, over 180,000 personnel, it proceeded with minimal violence. Both sides, exhausted and resigned, moved through the ritual of ending a war they had fought from opposite poles of ideology. The surrender of Courland marked one of the largest single capitulations on the Eastern Front. It encompassed not only German Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units, but also Kriegsmarine detachments, Luftwaffe personnel, and thousands of Latvian auxiliaries and conscripts. The Soviet military authorities made little distinction in treatment. All were classified as enemy combatants and subject to internment. For many of the captured troops, this was the beginning of a long and harrowing ordeal. They were marched under armed escort to improvised prison camps, where they awaited transfer to more permanent locations deeper within the Soviet Union. The surrender also exposed the immense scale of German fortification in Courland. Soviet engineers and officers were astonished at the complexity and depth of the defensive networks. Multi-layered trenches, reinforced bunkers, hidden artillery emplacements, and vast minefields stretching for kilometers. These fortifications had absorbed enormous labor and resources, yet had ultimately served no strategic value. They had not halted the Soviet advance, influenced the war's outcome, or protected the German heartland. They stood as a final monument to the futile stubbornness of Hitler's military doctrine. For Latvian collaborators, the surrender was particularly dangerous. Many attempted to disguise themselves among Wehrmacht ranks, discard their uniforms, or flee into the countryside. Soviet security forces, including NKVD detachments, conducted immediate sweeps to identify and apprehend suspected collaborators, partisan enemies, and anyone deemed politically unreliable. Thousands of Latvians were arrested, interrogated, and deported. Some were executed without trial. The Soviet authorities moved quickly to re-establish political control over the region, suppressing any vestige of nationalist sentiment and beginning a second wave of Sovietization in Latvia. The local civilian population, long caught between two occupying forces, emerged from the pocket with fear and uncertainty. Many had experienced years of war, deportation, forced labor, and ideological whiplash between Nazi and Soviet control. With the German surrender, they now faced reintegration into the Soviet Union, an outcome many dreaded. The Red Army's presence was swiftly followed by political commissars, party officials, and NKVD units tasked with rebuilding Soviet authority. Churches were shuttered, media censored, and community leaders replaced. Within months, Latvia was once again fully absorbed into the Soviet administrative and security apparatus. Despite the surrender, pockets of resistance would continue in Latvia for years. Known as the Forest Brothers, many former Latvian legionnaires and nationalists refused to surrender and instead melted into the forests to wage guerrilla warfare against Soviet rule. Their struggle, though ultimately crushed by the mid-1950s, ensured that Courland's legacy did not end with the German surrender. It transformed into a new phase of conflict, now fought not by armies, but by clandestine cells, saboteurs, and hunted patriots. The Courland surrender may not have changed the outcome of the Second World War, but it crystallized a final, unsettling truth. Even in total defeat, the structures of war can endure. Trenches can outlast treaties. Uniforms can survive ideologies. And men, caught in systems far beyond their control, can be ordered to fight long after their cause has died. In Courland, the guns finally fell silent, but the echoes of that long and unnecessary siege would linger for decades, in memory, in landscape, and in the unresolved wounds of a region twice conquered but never fully at peace. The fall of Courland was not merely a military surrender. It was the closing act of a grim theater that had been sustained far beyond its relevance. Yet even as the German officers laid down their sidearms and the Soviet divisions moved into position, another battle was beginning, one fought in silence, memory, and historical ambiguity. For the region of Courland, and for those who had served, suffered, or survived within its perimeter, the question of meaning remained unanswered. What had all the sacrifice, the entrenchment, the resistance truly accomplished? And what would be remembered, forgotten, or rewritten in the aftermath? In the weeks following the surrender, Soviet authorities moved quickly to exert full control over the territory. Former German positions were mapped, booby traps cleared, and remaining weapons stockpiles confiscated. Soviet propaganda presented the event as a final blow to fascism in the Baltics, but beneath the celebratory rhetoric, there was a deep unease. Courland had not been liberated in the traditional sense. It had been besieged and bled dry, its people trapped in a conflict not of their making. The Red Army's arrival did not signal peace for many Latvians, but the return of a repressive regime they had come to fear even more than the occupiers they replaced. In the forests surrounding Koldaga, Saldus, and Ventspils, the new Soviet rulers discovered not only trenches and minefields, but caches of hidden documents, radios, and even partisan equipment. Many Latvian soldiers and collaborators, anticipating retribution, had fled into the wilderness rather than surrender. These fugitives formed the nucleus of what would soon be known as the Forest Brothers movement, a decentralized resistance composed of former military personnel, nationalists, and civilians unwilling to accept Soviet domination. Their activity would confound Soviet security forces for nearly a decade, transforming Courland from a former battlefield into a zone of low-intensity insurgency and counterinsurgency. Meanwhile, the process of processing prisoners began on an industrial scale. Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS soldiers were divided by rank, function, and suspected affiliations. Officers were separated from enlisted men, medical personnel from combat troops, and volunteers from conscripts. The NKVD conducted mass interrogations to identify war criminals, ideological hardliners, or anyone with knowledge of German military intelligence. Some prisoners cooperated, hoping for better treatment. Others resisted or remained silent. The result was the same. Long columns of men marched under guard toward railway stations where they would be loaded into cattle cars bound for labor camps across the Soviet Union. The conditions in these camps were brutal. Most of the German prisoners taken from Courland were sent to camps in Siberia, the Urals, or Kazakhstan, where they were put to work rebuilding Soviet infrastructure destroyed during the war. Others were assigned to mining operations, forest clearing, or construction projects in extreme climates. Starvation, disease, exposure, and overwork claimed thousands. Letters home were censored or never delivered. For many families in Germany, the fate of those lost in Courland remained unknown for years. Some never received confirmation at all. Among the most contested aspects of the surrender was the treatment of the Latvian SS divisions. These troops, despite being classified as Waffen-SS, had often been conscripted under duress or joined out of fear of Soviet reoccupation. Nevertheless, Soviet authorities refused to differentiate between ideological Nazis and nationalists. Latvian prisoners were subjected to particularly harsh interrogation, and many were executed or disappeared into the Gulag system. Others, when released years later, were forbidden from returning to their homes or holding positions of influence. Their legacy would be buried under decades of Soviet silence. Civilians, too, were not spared. As Soviet rule reasserted itself, mass deportations resumed. Families of suspected collaborators, nationalists, or simply those deemed politically unreliable were rounded up and exiled to Siberia and Central Asia. The purges of 1949 would see tens of thousands of Latvians removed from their homes, often with only minutes to pack. Entire villages emptied overnight. The goal was not merely to punish, but to erase the social structures that had supported resistance or independence. In this new phase of control, fear became the currency of governance. While the physical scars of war, bombed-out buildings, shattered roads, scorched forests, could be repaired, the psychological trauma endured. For those who had survived the siege, there was no return to normalcy. The war had fragmented communities, destroyed families, and left behind a void where faith in either occupying force had long since vanished. Stories of arbitrary executions, disappearances, and betrayals circulated quietly, passed from one household to another in whispers. Public expressions of grief or remembrance were dangerous. Even to speak of Courland as anything but a Soviet victory invited suspicion. In the wider context of post-war Europe, the Courland pocket quickly faded into obscurity. The grand narratives of the Second World War, Normandy, Stalingrad, Berlin, dominated public memory. Courland, distant and peripheral, received little attention from Western historians or media. It became a historical footnote, an odd detail, a curiosity, the last bastion of a lost cause. The suffering endured there, the complexities of loyalty and occupation, the moral gray zones of survival, all were glossed over by the simplicity of Victor's justice. Yet for the Baltic peoples, the memory of Courland lingered. It became a symbol of unresolved identity, of the cost of being caught between two totalitarian empires. For some, it represented resistance against Soviet oppression. For others, a tragic entanglement with a monstrous regime. It was a place where lines blurred, where patriotism could look like treason, where survival demanded impossible choices. And for the thousands who died in its forests, bunkers, and prison camps, Courland remained the final chapter of a war that offered no redemption, only endurance. In the end, the siege of Courland was not about territory, victory, or even ideology. It was about inertia, the inability of a regime to let go of its illusions, and the human cost of its denial. The guns may have fallen silent, but the silence itself became a testimony to everything that had gone unsaid, undone, and unforgiven. In the decades that followed the end of World War II, the Courland pocket remained a largely neglected episode in both Western and Soviet historiography. Its military irrelevance to the final outcome of the war meant it was often dismissed as a footnote, an anachronistic holdout rather than a meaningful theater of combat. Yet beneath the surface of this marginalization lay a rich, painful, and unresolved legacy. The soldiers who had fought there, the civilians who had suffered there, and the region that had been transformed into a fortress and graveyard carried the memory of Courland long after the war's end. In the Soviet Union, official narratives about the Courland campaign were shaped by the needs of state propaganda. The siege was portrayed as a heroic and methodical operation by the Red Army, culminating in the cleansing of fascist remnants from Soviet soil. Textbooks, veterans' memoirs, and official commemorations emphasized the triumph of socialist perseverance over reactionary encirclement. The complexity of Latvian collaboration, the suffering of civilians under both German and Soviet rule, and the existence of post-war resistance movements were excluded from public discourse. Soviet historiography flattened the region's wartime experience into a simple tale of victory and liberation, silencing alternative narratives through censorship, intimidation, and repressive policies. In West Germany, the Courland campaign was shrouded in discomfort. Many of the German divisions trapped in the pocket had remained there due to Hitler's refusal to redeploy them. Their sacrifice had not been part of any grand strategy, nor had it protected the homeland from invasion. Veterans of Courland, particularly those who had survived years in Soviet captivity, were often met with indifference or polite dismissal upon return. The campaign was rarely discussed in public forums. It lacked the tragic nobility of Stalingrad or the heroism of the Western Front. For many Germans, it was a bitter reminder of futile obedience and waste. In Latvia, the memory of Courland was far more visceral and contested. Under Soviet rule, open discussion of the pocket and the role Latvians had played in it, either as conscripts, volunteers, or civilians, was prohibited. Public monuments commemorated only the Soviet victory. Graves of German soldiers and Latvian Waffen-SS units were left untended or deliberately destroyed. Families of deported or executed Latvians could not speak openly of their losses. Yet despite this enforced silence, a quiet memory persisted. Stories were passed down within families, sometimes whispered in kitchens, sometimes etched into the margins of photo albums and prayer books. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the newly independent Republic of Latvia was faced with the task of reclaiming its history. The narrative surrounding Courland, and the war more broadly, had to be rewritten, but the lines were not easy to draw. The Latvian Legion, whose soldiers had fought under German command in the Courland pocket, was re-evaluated not solely as a fascist force, but also as a manifestation of anti-Soviet sentiment. Controversial commemorations began to appear. Some honored Latvian veterans who had fought against the Red Army, not as Nazis, but as nationalists resisting occupation. These events were met with outrage from Russia and criticism from international observers, highlighting the deep historical wounds that still bled beneath the surface. Memorials and museums began to emerge, attempting to present a more nuanced picture of the Courland siege. Exhibits included German and Soviet artifacts, personal testimonies from survivors, and documentation of post-war deportations. For the first time, civilians who had lived through the siege could speak publicly about the starvation, the shelling, and the arbitrary violence from both sides. Former soldiers, now elderly, shared their memories of trench life, surrender, and captivity. These recollections painted a picture not of glory or ideological struggle, but of exhaustion, confusion, and the psychological toll of fighting a war whose end had already been written. The terrain of Courland itself also began to reveal its buried past. Metal detectors uncovered helmets, rifles, and dog tags. Excavations found mass graves, sometimes carefully marked, sometimes hastily dug and forgotten. Local efforts, often led by volunteer historians and veteran organizations, sought to identify remains and return them to families, German, Latvian, and Soviet alike. These gestures, while modest, reflected a growing desire to humanize the narrative, to acknowledge the individual lives lost amid the vast machinery of total war. In modern Latvia, the legacy of Courland remains politically sensitive. Debates continue over how to commemorate the events of 1944-1945. Is the Latvian Legion a symbol of national resistance or collaboration? Should the graves of German soldiers be preserved alongside Soviet memorials? What role did local civilians play in aiding or resisting the occupiers? These questions resist easy answers, yet their persistence reveals the continued relevance of Courland's history in shaping national identity and public memory. Internationally, scholarly interest in the Courland pocket has grown slowly but steadily. Military historians have begun to reassess its operational significance, not for its impact on the war's outcome, but as a case study in ideological warfare, command failure, and human endurance under siege. The campaign illustrates how war can continue long after it has lost its meaning, sustained by delusion, habit, and institutional inertia. It also shows how civilians and soldiers alike adapt, survive, and remember under the most extreme conditions. For the Baltic region, Courland was not simply a battlefield, but a crucible in which the identities of occupier, liberator, and victim were endlessly recast. The siege may have ended in 1945, but the struggle over its meaning continues. In textbooks, in legislation, in monuments both erected and torn down. It is a reminder that wars do not conclude neatly. Their echoes ripple across generations, reshaping landscapes, languages, and lives in ways no ceasefire can truly end. In that sense, the Courland pocket remains not a forgotten front, but an unresolved one. Today, the Courland pocket stands as one of the most enduring enigmas of the Second World War's Eastern Front, a military anomaly frozen in time, whose physical boundaries collapsed in May 1945, but whose historical implications continue to provoke debate, reflection, and reinterpretation. Unlike the sweeping offensives that reshaped empires or the climactic battles that ended regimes, Courland left behind no clear victors, no dramatic turning point, and no decisive narrative. Instead, it offers a sobering case study of prolonged warfare detached from strategic purpose, and of how ideology, fear, and inertia can trap entire armies and populations in cycles of suffering long after victory or defeat has become irrelevant. Militarily, the siege of Courland provided no benefit to the collapsing Nazi war effort. The 200,000 soldiers encircled there could have reinforced critical fronts in East Prussia, Pomerania, or Berlin, where every division might have delayed Soviet advances or slowed the final unraveling of the Reich. But Hitler's insistence on retaining Courland as a symbolic fortress reflected a broader pathology of Nazi strategic thought in its final phase, rigid, ceremonial, and disconnected from military logic. The result was a static war of attrition waged in forests and fields that held no strategic value beyond the imaginary lines on a Führer's map. For the Soviet Union, Courland presented a dilemma of resource allocation. Stalin's decision to bypass a full-scale liquidation of the pocket was not driven by mercy, but by prioritization. The drive to Berlin took precedence, and Courland was relegated to a secondary theater. Yet the long-term implications of that decision lingered. The region remained militarized, destabilized, and politically charged. Even in victory, the Red Army inherited a territory burdened by deep scars and a populace traumatized by years of shifting occupation, suspicion, and survivalism. The Courland siege also illuminates the complexities of collaboration, resistance, and memory in occupied territories. In Latvia, the experience of war defied binary categorizations. Latvians had fought on both sides, some as conscripts, others as volunteers, some out of conviction, others out of fear or pragmatism. For them, Courland was not simply a battlefield, it was a crucible of identity. Post-war Soviet narratives refused to acknowledge this nuance, branding all collaborators as traitors and all Red Army fighters as liberators. But in truth, many Latvians viewed the Soviet return not as liberation, but as the resumption of a brutal regime they had already endured once. The question of how to remember Courland remains unresolved even now. In the post-Soviet era, Latvia has struggled to navigate between honoring national resilience and acknowledging historical complicity. Commemoration events for Latvian Legion veterans are held each year, drawing both support and condemnation. Western observers often view them through the lens of broader European narratives about fascism and memory, while Russian media exploits them for propaganda, accusing Latvia of glorifying Nazism. Yet within Latvia, the conversation is more complex, rooted in personal histories, family trauma, and a national desire to reclaim a voice long suppressed. For historians, Courland offers critical insight into the psychological and institutional forces that prolong war. The siege was not sustained by tactical necessity, but by political will, command culture, and the mythos of the last stand. It reveals how wars can become self-perpetuating systems, where the original objectives are lost, yet the machinery grinds on, fed by bureaucracy, fear of punishment, and a misplaced sense of duty. It also shows how landscapes can become militarized to the point that peace becomes logistically and mentally elusive, even when it is the only rational outcome. The physical remnants of the Courland pocket still dot the Latvian countryside. Bunkers lie half-buried under moss. Trenches are reclaimed by trees. Rusting helmets, shell casings, and shattered weapons surface after heavy rains or are uncovered by farmers plowing fields. These relics, both mundane and haunting, serve as unintentional monuments, not to glory, but to endurance. They whisper the story of a front where time stood still, where men held positions not because they believed in them, but because they were told to, and where the meaning of war dissolved into routine, fear, and resignation. In the final measure, the Courland pocket does not fit cleanly into the heroic or tragic arcs of the Second World War. It is not a symbol of resistance, nor a theater of decisive action. Instead, it stands as a chilling emblem of stagnation, a war after the war, waged because it had not yet been officially called off. It reminds us that history is not only made in grand offensives and political declarations, but also in forgotten enclaves where lives are spent for no cause, and silence becomes the only remaining order. The siege of Courland ended without a final battle, without a defining explosion, and without fanfare. But its legacy persists, as a space of unresolved memory, contested identity, and historical caution. In the forests of western Latvia, the ground still holds the bones of soldiers who died without knowing why. Their story is not one of victory or defeat, but of endurance in the absence of reason. And in that silence, Courland speaks louder than any battlefield ever could.